Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for December 15th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody. I am really excited for this conversation we're about to have, as we're going to be talking about a film that I have been thinking about nonstop since I saw it some weeks ago. I was lucky enough to even give it a rewatch earlier today.
Oh,
so
dang.
I am prepped.
Where did you
and
find
ready
that
to go.
time?
Well, I happen to live with a child that needs to nap during the day. And
I was going to say, you sound like a good father exposing your child to Nickel Boys at such a young age.
Well, it's quite the opposite in the sense we had a night bitch-esque kicking and screaming, trying to get him down for a nap escapade.
Oh, gosh.
Which, lasted about 35, 40 minutes. It was quite the exercise trying to get him down to sleep.
Sure.
However, after wrestling with him, almost literally wrestling with him to get him down for a nap, he was out cold, and that gave me an opportunity.
Well, that's
and
good.
I took advantage of said opportunity.
I can only imagine, though, that you would be more attentive as a father figure than Scoot McNairy was in Night Bitch.
Yeah, try to be anyway.
Yeah,
Certainly am around. I'm not traveling nearly as
You
much.
are
That
a
is
good
for
dad,
sure.
my friend.
I'm also really excited for this conversation because we have a really awesome guest joining us. I am
We
very,
do.
very excited. It's been a while since she's been here, but I'm really happy to bring back onto the show Sophia Ciminello. Sophia, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Woo!
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me back. I can't
Yeah.
wait to talk about this movie. One of my
Yes.
favorites of the year.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Some of you, if you've seen any marketing for this movie, you already know how Sophia feels about it because her name is plastered everywhere with the marketing for this movie, which is very exciting.
It's
I'm so
crazy.
happy for you.
Yeah,
Honestly,
congrats on
it's-
that. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been honestly wild. I haven't had a quote with my name on a poster before. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
just seeing it everywhere in banners at my local movie theater and in the trailer, it was really exciting. And yeah, when I said it's a new American masterpiece, I meant it, and I still feel that way. So
Yeah.
That's so great.
So,
Yeah, we were
spoiler
talking
alert.
about that. We were talking about this offline. How your non-film critic friends and family will be
Yeah.
thinking about this if they were to see it and not agree with how you feel about
Yeah.
it.
No
That'll be
pressure.
for an
I
interesting
know.
conversation around the holidays.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
been very funny, right? My coworkers from my day job, which is not in the film industry or
Mhm.
anything like that, have started to see the trailer and see the poster and have commented on
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
to me and share that they're really excited to see it. And I think that's great. But this film is also just so bold, and it's a different kind of film with
Yeah.
what RaMell Ross did. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear what they think of it.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. There's a lot of conversation to be had. There's no
Mhm.
doubt about
Yeah.
that. So we'll be poking you and getting some updates once your friends and family are able to catch up and see that one.
Mhm.
Curious how that goes. All right. Well, as we jump into this, I guess I just wanted to get some background on RaMell Ross. So for me, anyway, he jumps on the scene in what was that 2018 with Hale County
Hale
when
County,
that
yeah.
documentary came out.
Yeah.
That was something, and now here he is with this film. Sophia, what is your relationship with RaMell Ross?
So I saw Hale County this evening in theaters, actually. I saw it at BAM in
Okay.
Brooklyn, and I went in knowing nothing about it really at all. The time just worked out, and I was really floored by the visual language and just thought, this is someone we need to be paying attention to, we need to watch. And it, I think, makes a lot of sense that he's also a professor and he's an academic and he teaches
Yeah.
photography courses, and the way that he speaks about art and filmmaking is fascinating to me. I could listen to him talk about it for hours because he's, I think, brilliant. And also he speaks about it in a way that just makes you think differently about everything. So I was a big fan of Hale County. And then from there, I think when it was announced that he was doing Nickel Boys, I was really intrigued by it because I actually interviewed Anjanou Ellis-Taylor last year for her work in Origin. And that's just such an incredible performance. And in doing prep work for that conversation, I had read a little bit more about Nickel Boys, but didn't know too much. So I asked her a little bit about it at the end of the interview, and she just told me, I remember, that she thought RaMell was brilliant and that it was going to be a very beautiful film. So already excited, had read the book too. So I think also when we think about Colson Whitehead adaptations, Barry Jenkins has also made his mark there with the Underground Railroad, and I think that's some of his finest work too. But I think with what RaMell Ross did with Hale County, I was really hoping he would bring his skills as a photographer and documentarian into this. And when I saw it, I was so surprised that he didn't let up. Like, he didn't really let Hollywood take that away.
Took
from
that
him.
very literally. I feel like.
Yeah, exactly.
More so than we may have been expecting. And I'm so glad that he retain that ethos that we saw in Hale County this evening, which is a very observational piece. It was very reminiscent of other documentaries such as Heart of a Dog by Laurie Anderson, or even Camera Person by Kirsten Johnson, that feels very much like a picture book in some ways. It's meant to capture a moment and how we feel about that. And I love that he retains that approach, that he does ultimately feel like, or his movies do feel like he does come from some type of teaching background, because it does feel like he's trying to challenge the norm of what narrative features can ultimately be, which we'll talk about further with Nickel Boys. And I find that really fascinating. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I'm glad you brought up the novel here, Sophia, which I have not read, but the novel by Colson Whitehead, especially when it came out in 2019, I know it had a huge influx of people talking about it at that time. I remember a great interview that Colson Whitehead even did on, I think it was The Daily Show, with Trevor Noah, talking about this and how it was even so different from something like the Underground Railroad. So the novel does have a huge reputation, and I kind of want to read it now, having seen this movie, kind of going in the opposite direction, just to see how the perspective that RaMell Ross chooses to focus on here, how that translates to the idea of narrative and how it's employed in the written form as well.
Yeah. I'm glad that you liked it without having read the book, because I think that was one of my questions really after I saw the film, was how will this work for people who maybe aren't familiar with the text? Does reading it beforehand give you sort of a key into it? And to have heard now from multiple people that, now I want to read the book. I hadn't read the book first, and the film works on its own. I think that's really exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that never read the book first, if I can help it. I'm a film person first. So I always go to the books and novels later. And unless it's something from childhood or something to that effect. But I now that I've seen the film, I am desperate to go back and give that a go. Same thing with Queer as well. Like, that's a novel I want to go back to and check out now that I've seen the movie, as we just had that conversation with Eric yesterday as this episode is dropped. As for Nickel Boys and RaMell Ross, Hale County was incredible. That was one of my favorite documentaries of that year. And while I did not really know much about Nickel Boys coming into the year, the one thing that I think was a certainty, an objective certainty, was that it was going to be absolutely gorgeous to look at, because Hale County is a really phenomenally well shot documentary. It is immaculate from a cinematography perspective. And Nickel Boys not only features the same, visionary artist behind the camera or coming to this project rather, but now he's teaming up with a cinematographer in Joe Mofray, who also shot All Dirt Roads Taste of Salt. And if you've seen that film, impeccably crafting from a cinematography perspective. So at the very least, those two minds coming together, this was going to be just a buffet of images for us to digest.
Movie. Yeah.
We knew that going. That was the one thing I was maybe most excited about. And then the early reviews drop and the festival hype certainly kicks in, and that, heightens your anticipation all the more. So,
right.
The personnel here, the craftsmen, if you will,
we were in good hands.
We were in good hands. Absolutely. Okay. I think with all of that laid out, let's go ahead and jump into this. Nickel Boys is directed by RaMell Ross. It stars Ethan Hersey, Brandon Wilson, Fred Hershenji, a.k.a. Joaquin Phoenix Jr., David Diggs,
I still don't see it as much as you do.
Look, it's going to be my thing. I'm going to say it every time, okay?
I'm going to look for it now, I have to say. Wow.
I don't know if you've heard before, Sophia, or anyone listening to this. It's certainly been something that I've been saying a lot. If you look at his mannerisms and you really pay attention to the details of his performances, it is a mimicry of Joaquin Phoenix. I'm telling you, they are the same person. And I'm just saying, if you watch Gladiator 2, I think Ridley Scott, I think he believes the same thing for reasons
that's interesting.
We can talk about later. If you listen to our review of Gladiator 2, I go really in depth on that.
Oh yeah. When he says in depth, he's not kidding. That was probably like a 5 or 6 minute portion of the whole conversation.
Yeah, no, I really go into it. I'm telling you.
You could write a paper on that analysis.
At any rate, Nickel Boys. If you're not familiar with Nickel Boys, it chronicles the powerful friendship between two young African-American men navigating the harrowing trials of reform school together in Florida. All right, let's get into this. We'll start with you, Sophia. What did you think about Nickel Boys?
So I saw this for the first time back at Telluride at the world premiere. And I had just seen Conclave, film festival experiences. You always are seeing multiple things in a day. And I was pretty let down by Conclave, actually, especially compared to some of the people I think I saw it with or who were also at the festival. And Nickel Boys, I figured, might be my movie that day because I was looking forward to it so much and I knew I was going to be reviewing it. But as the film started, and I realized what RaMell Ross was doing with this first-person point of view or sentient perspective, as he and Joe Mofrey have come to call it. At first, I thought, okay, this is a really audacious way to start a film. And then I thought it was going to switch back to something we're used to with a narrative feature, and it didn't. He just went with it, and I thought that was so exciting. And as the film progressed, I realized that I just had slipped right into it and it wasn't something I noticed anymore. It was, a feature and not a bug. And I realized in real time, I think, that I was watching something that was changing the art form. I hadn't seen anything like this, and that is so rare. I mean, you guys are the same. We watch hundreds of movies every year.
Yeah.
New releases that we love to ones that we are begrudgingly watching to fill the bottom of our list or see if there's maybe something to cling on to there, whether it's a craft or a performance or whatever. But to see a film that you're realizing, oh, okay, this is going to be taught in schools someday, or this is going to change the way that a new generation of filmmakers are going to see the world and see film. That is so rare. I can count on maybe one hand the times that that's happened for me. And I was thinking a lot about two other films when I watched this. I was thinking a lot about The Zone of Interest, Jonathan Glazer's film, and how that plays with perspective. And I was thinking a lot about The Tree of Life, and in particular, how Malick uses specific images and focuses on specific objects to remind you of a memory. And that's how I felt when I was watching this, but it felt so much, I think, deeper and bolder than what I could have ever imagined. So I loved it right away. I wanted to sing its praises. And then from there, I think it just became a film that I wanted to champion and talk about all season. So
Yeah,
I love this a lot.
it's funny you talk about how you can only count on maybe one hand these types of experiences that you have with a movie like this, because my first thought and what I wrote on my Letterboxd review was, if I had a nickel for every time I saw a movie this year and uttered to myself, I have never seen anything like that before, I would probably have very little money, but Nickel Boys made me 5 cents richer. It absolutely did. I agree with everything you're saying, Sophia. I think this is a stunning film, and I think, like you said, could potentially redefine how narrative itself is utilized in film going forward. Because more often than not, while this isn't the first movie to employ first person as its primary narrative focus, oftentimes it might feel like a distraction or a failed experiment. You look all the way back to, movies like Lady in the Lake, one of the first ever, if not the first ever example of this. Or it might be too video gamey, which is often the point sometimes. Let's say you look at a
Like in
movie like Hardcore
1917.
1917 maybe, or something like Hardcore Henry, which is probably the most, like, it's literal. I never thought I'd be comparing this to Hardcore Henry during this review, but they are nothing alike. Please take that for what it's worth. If anything, it's to emphasize how Nickel Boys and how RaMell Ross and Jomo Frey are utilizing this technique to really create what is ultimately the most immersive experience of the year. I think this is as immersive as it gets. It's a form of participation in a lot of ways. It's the most literal example of what it means to step into someone else's shoes. And it's very surprising that it really commits to that. At times, it does sort of trick you with the narrative focus, because it is very much a first person thing, but it's also kind of, I don't want to say omniscient because it's not all knowing, but it does switch between perspectives every now and then. It is, in a way, it's kind of utilizing a first-person lens to tell a third-person limited narrative, which, combining all of that together, is really intriguing and makes this one of the most thrilling films of the year, not just because of how it challenges the form, and it's fun for us as film lovers to see those things, but it kind of makes you feel what this time period must have been like from someone that maybe can't relate to it. And I love the way that it feels like this form of participation. Like I said before, it's really quite insightful.
Yeah, I am totally with you guys. This is one of the very, very best films of the year. As far as I am concerned, the best director race begins and ends with RaMell Ross. The proficiency of his filmmaking is one thing, and boy, does he show deft command, but it's especially breathtaking given how experimental it is. We've never seen a film like this before, as you guys wonderfully articulated. There's been other attempts at POV, but none as graceful or assiduous as this one. The POV here isn't a gimmick. It's a brilliant way to expose how an abusive system gives you perspective, shifting your view of the world around you, which is why I love the alternating viewpoints throughout the film between Elwood and Turner, because it offers up a subjective and objective observation on what's really happening with these characters, especially with Elwood, who is really our central protagonist in the film. It's an invigorating way to tell this story, giving the film a unique pathos that simultaneously deconstructs what is decades of film language. Not to mention, it's one of the most beautiful looking films of the year. The cinematography, shocking, is sensational. Alex Sommer's score is really, really terrific as well.
Very
the performances
ethereal. I love it.
Are affecting. Simply, Ross's direction is nothing short of sublime. I was deeply, deeply moved by this film, giving us a small dose of what it is to experience the world through black eyes is one thing, and it's really stirring here, but it's also this portrait of two friends bonding in the worst of circumstances. And there's something about the innocence of that here, the purity of it, the deep profundity of it that took my breath away. I cannot say enough good things about this film. I think from top to bottom, it is, as Sophia wonderfully put it in her review, it is an American masterpiece.
It is. And Brendan, what you were saying about being active and being engaged, I think is really important, because that's something that RaMell Ross has talked about, and in using and utilizing this point of view, it's making you realize your own, really, how complicit you are in things that may have even happened before your lifetime. Right?
Yeah.
Because this is based on Nickel Academy is based on the Dozier School for Boys. So we're looking at, you know, a fictionalized representation of real events, but it's forcing you to suddenly take this active view into that and perspective. And I think beginning as Elwood is small and seeing things that, like Christmas lights or citrus on a tree or a bracelet on a woman's wrist. Those are things that, you know, when we think back on our childhood and when we were young, it's often the memories we have aren't tied to birthdays or specific, like, big events, right? That we think they would. They're
beauty in the
little,
mundane.
small things. Yeah. And so
such as grandma throwing tinsel on you when you're underneath the Christmas tree.
That's so beautiful. And then so what does that do when later Elwood is at Nickel and we see the lights up in that tree, right? It connects it to an earlier moment for him. And again, thinking about Elwood learning about his identity as a Black person in this time, like when we first see that shot of him looking at his arm or looking at in the window at all of those TVs with Martin Luther King speaking, those, and being able to see slightly Elwood's reflection in that, and that being one of those instances, one of the few instances in the beginning when we're able to see the character that we're living in the film as, connecting that then to his experience and how he is learning about the civil rights movement and what it's like to live in the Jim Crow South. I think that it's such a smart directorial choice by Ross.
Yeah, and the way that the cinematography here, Joe Mofrey, and then also RaMell Ross's direction, they choose to emphasize certain gestures to still provide those points to us. Like there are a lot of like, even though this is from an eye view between really, I mean, it's mostly Elwood as our primary protagonist, but occasionally we will shift between Elwood and Turner, which is, first off, that sequence when that shift first happens is one of the most striking things I've seen all year.
It's my favorite scene, maybe.
Yeah,
I think.
And the way it recontextualizes how certain communications were had and how they were maybe implied from the first perspective, we realize, him saying thanks for that is actually him gesturing to this, you know, this confrontation that may have happened. And it reveals new layers as it goes. But what I was going to say earlier, there are a lot of shots here where we actually can still see Elwood's hands reaching out for things. And that does say a lot. One of my other favorite examples, and how it creates this juxtaposition between childhood innocence, but the reality of this, is when he's simply twirling a string on his finger, watching it turn red by keeping the blood there, right? Treating it like a tournament, which every kid has probably done.
Oh yeah, I still do that. I mean,
it's a great way to pass the time, right? But we have a lot of sequences like that. Even the way that his hand kind of plays with a string tied to a light bulb, little things like that, and these gestures do speak very loudly. So when things become a bit more serious, for lack of a better term, in the back half of the film, they mean different things. And I love that, how all of this, it's really well thought out. It's really smartly done.
No, I completely agree. I mean, the cinematography and the use of the camera here is really quite invigorating. There are a lot of extreme close-ups. Sometimes it's on mundane things like wrapping string around your finger. Sometimes there's certainly more visual symbolism at play.
Yeah.
But the framing of this film, how the camera often rotates and shakes, it is really stimulating to watch. And I completely with you guys, we have to talk about it. That scene where Elwood and Turner meet there at the lunch table is one of the best scenes of the year, where we are introduced to the scene with the perspective of Elwood, who we have been through the eyes of up until that point in the film. And we cut to this sequence of images, a lingering shot of inside a train car as time passes by. And then we get some images that are wholly recontextualized when you get to the end of the film.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get to our first perspective of Turner, but it's the same interaction at the table. And to your point, Brendan, and something I mentioned in my opening thoughts, it's why I love the alternating viewpoints of this film, because it offers up that subjective and objective observation on these characters, how they see the world, and how it impacts their dynamic, which is obviously a big part of this film, is the contrast between them and ultimately how they infuse each other as things progress. And yeah, that contrast of the visual beauty here and the intimacy that is brought to this film through the cinematography, in contrast to the grim reality of the abuse that they're experiencing, that is really quite something to experience here. Again, in that first person point of view, we've just never seen anything like it to this degree, like this level of gracefulness. I'm blown away by it. It's incredible.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary scene. And I think what makes it really so moving to me is that when you watch it for the first time and he chooses to replay that scene, but from Turner's perspective.
Yeah.
It's honestly, I was just so taken aback by what it would feel like to see.
I couldn't breathe during that.
Elwood for the first time, because you've really been with him in a way that you haven't been with another character maybe ever before, and to see him in that way.
And you're significantly into the film at that point, right? Like
exactly.
that, like 30 minutes in, something.
And even so, and Elwood still feels like a realized character by that point, even before we've had a chance to really see him. And this is why Ethan Harasy's performance is so good. The vocal performance alone, I think, is enough to carry it.
Well, and what I realized when I was watching it, and Doreen St. Felix, she just wrote a great review of this in the New Yorker that I highly recommend reading, but she talks about this, is that when you see Elwood's body language, it's actually not what you would expect by hearing him and really living through him, because he's hunched over like a kid would be eating his oatmeal. He seems shy. He's really, I think, dubious of Turner and who he is, because he doesn't want to be a nickel, and they have very, very different viewpoints on the world.
Yes.
But to see Elwood like that, from an outsider's perspective, but now you are that outsider, you are that stranger.
Yeah.
There's something really, I'm not finding the words to be able to say how I felt watching it, because it does take your breath away.
You know, a movie is great when you can't articulate why you love it sometimes, which makes it seem like we're failing at our jobs as film critics. But
I know
sometimes that's the most that's the best praise you can give a movie. It's like, this movie's intimidating me. I want to talk about how much I love it, but I don't know how to do that. I do agree. What I love so much about this movie as well is the different viewpoints between both Turner and Elwood, and I think that's also like indirectly established in that meet between the two of them at the lunch table, where we kind of got a sense that Elwood, to your point, Sophia, and the New Yorker there, he seems to carry himself internally with a bit more gravitas. At least his vocal performance seems to suggest that. But no, he actually does have this timidity to him that is at least perceived from a different person. So there is a bit of an irony there in how that character is portrayed. But they do have very different viewpoints on the world, as we come to learn. One of them is certainly more optimistic and believes in change, while the other is more pessimistic. And I think the two balance each other out very beautifully, not just from a thematic standpoint, but also just as a tale of friendship. If you want to overlook, which I certainly wouldn't recommend, if you want to overlook some of the more sociopolitical implications of this movie, you still have a very beautiful film about friendship. Like, on the surface, the movie still absolutely works. But I think going further, those differing viewpoints, I think, really add a lot of layers here.
Yeah, I think the element of this film that moved me the most, and we've already somewhat touched on it, Sophia, you were just referencing there a little bit, as far as the lost innocence of this film. And that, to me, I think, was what I was perhaps moved by the most. And sometimes it comes through in these small gestures, even as small as again, to that moment, that example you brought up earlier, Brennan, of wrapping string around your finger, something everyone here has done as a child, right? And these characters throughout this film are trying to maintain some sort of youthful innocence and fervor, despite the arduous context. They joke around a lot. There are pranks on each other. Sometimes we see them jumping around and behaving rebelliously, but in a way, like teenagers do. You think of something like the whole boxing sequence that takes place near the end of the film, I think is a big part of that here. There's one scene where Elwood and Turner get to swim in a pool after helping a local white woman with some chores around her house, invoking some of the most youthful imagery of the film. One of my favorite moments is when Elwood is reading Pride and Prejudice and has to explain to Turner what the book is about. And there's some fun banter.
When he says they say she has a handsome face. Like, it's just such a funny line.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there's a lot of the behavior they demonstrate here is very youthful in nature, something that is constantly undermined by the constant abuse they experience at the system in which they are constrained to. And that lost innocence, I do think, is really quite devastating, especially when you get to the end of this film and we see how it all crystallizes. As much as this film is about trauma, it's certainly about friendship. It's about redemption and accountability, the dualities of morality, which we can certainly get into all of that. But that idea of lost innocence and how that is so top of mind in this film when you think about what these characters are doing from scene to scene, because they are ultimately teenagers. So they're going to behave like teenagers, despite, again, the arduous context. We see them trying to hold on to that youthfulness as much as possible, even if that means rebelling out against the system. That's what they're going to do. And that specific polarity here just broke me by the end, like in a beautiful way, but it's just so heartbreaking.
Well, and I think this is a story about their friendship too. And as the friendship progresses, the perspective shifts more frequently, and it's seamless every time as we're going back and forth from Elwood to Turner and them having different outlooks on life. I also think this is, in some ways, this lightly queer coded love story between the two of them. I really do. Like, you see little like touches and glances that they have with each other that I think are like can be fairly common with teenage boys. It's just an area in film and literature that's not as explored or in everyday life. And I feel like I felt that some between Elwood and Turner. And I also think there's something where, JD, you're talking about the loss of innocence. One of the really incredible things that RaMell Ross does with the camera is that there are a few times when, and we can talk about the David Diggs section too, but when he pulls the camera out and places it behind the shoulder or behind the head, and the only
we never see
time
Diggs's face.
Right. The only time we see that in the past at Nickel is when Elwood is taken and forced into that room to be subjected to the violence. There's a short moment where the camera goes out, and that makes you think like, oh, he is having a total out of body experience now, and we have that with him. And because Ross and Jomo Frey then choose to incorporate, instead of showing the violence, which I think is what we're accustomed to in these kinds of stories about trauma, racial violence, we're used to seeing that sometimes in a gross or gratuitous way. And here, what they do instead is we hear it and they reframe it, and he shows historical
those
photos,
black and white
archival
images.
footage.
Oh
so
my
we
gosh.
know this is it's generational, it's collective, it's real. That I think is so important that he does that there.
I love that.
Crazy transition. A crazy transition.
I love that. But weirdly, in doing so, I feel like what RaMell Ross is trying to do is make us as the audience also a character in this narrative, as if we're now finally becoming observers in this thing. And now we have to start kind of analyzing things. And I think that's ultimately why the scenes involving Daveed Diggs, which I guess it's present time adjacent in a way.
It moves through it, yeah.
Yeah, but we're always from the back of his head, as if we're trying to offer some type of, I don't want to say judgment, but some type of observation, as if this is RaMell Ross finally asking us to participate in this in a different way. And I love how it's handled there, and I love that when we get, I'm trying to say this very carefully, because for a movie as artful as this is, it's also not like above a twist ending of sorts. It does kind of have some of those traditional tropes that we might see in other kinds of movies like that, and it's absolutely riveting when it gets to that point. And I was blown away and very surprised by where it ends up going. And I love how it's able to commit to that without losing sight of its pre-established ethos to become something that it wasn't. I think it's really well balanced.
Yeah, it's really great. I think those scenes with Daveed Diggs are really wonderful. That choice to put the camera behind him, I think, is a phenomenal one. And I think we would be remiss to not mention, we talked about the lunch scene as maybe the scene of this film, but another great contender has to be that moment in the bar.
The bar scene. Oh,
Elwood
absolutely.
and another former inmate there, and the conversation they have, the pathos that underlies that whole moment, the exchange. It is
one of the most
brutal,
thrilling questions.
Yeah.
In a movie I heard all year. You really don't remember? You really don't remember? The way he asks that is, oh man, that's a gut punch.
And at that point, it's cluing us in as to where this is going to go, and you do have this unsettling feeling that something significant is about to happen, and it's going to unravel in some sort of way, which is why I absolutely do want to talk about that contrast between those two characters, because that is such a pivotal part as to what provokes the actions in the climax of this film. But yeah, that bar scene and the exchanges there, it is pretty devastating to watch, and the performances there are just incredible. I mean, Daveed Diggs is great, and forgive me, I'm not sure of the actor he's going up against there, but man, what a phenomenal moment in this film.
Well, there are a few times in the film when they choose to depict physical touch, loving physical touch, or physical touch that is, a hug or a handshake, not that of violence, and this is one of them. And again, the moment where we see the adult that he meets at the bar turn into the child from Nickel is such a strong detail too, because again, connecting back to that idea of memory and you don't remember, but then after he's listed off all of those things that he remembered instead, it's like that's a dark thing, right? Of what your mind doesn't cling on to and remember, and sometimes when those memories come flooding back in. And it's also, a way to show that it doesn't, they can be investigating what's happening at Nickel and uncovering all of these graves and looking at all of the historical horrors that happen there. But that doesn't mean that the men who left or who were there as children have forgotten that or have recovered from that. It's that idea too of like being taken care of by a government and by your society. That's not happening, right? He's just left on his own trying to find a job surfing couches. So
at no fault of his own either.
And no fault of his own, exactly.
Yeah, as you both were talking there, I was trying to look this up. It was Chicky Pete, the character that he runs into, because adult Chicky Pete here is played by Craig Tate. So let's call out Craig Tate for giving a really great performance in that one.
Really good. Yeah.
And transitioning back to the young Chicky Pete was played by Trey Perkins. So credit where credit is due. Really great scene, and it's a very tense scene too, because it introduces itself in a way that feels sort of, I don't know if loving is the right word, but there is this mutual respect between the two of them, given their respective situations, right? And the fact that they both dealt with this horrific environment at Nickel in the same way, but it does sort of evolve into a way that becomes kind of tense, especially when like I mentioned earlier, that aforementioned question you really don't remember is asked to Chicky Pete, and it
Mhm.
it almost makes it feel like this is going to go in a more almost violent direction, and the way that RaMell Ross plays with suspense in a way that's not traditional, I really liked as well. So it's really great filmmaking in that regard too.
Yeah, absolutely. Another phenomenal use of lost innocence in this film as well. Like,
Hmm.
there's just so many layers happening in that moment. It's really quite remarkable. And I do want to perhaps use that as a jumping board to talk a little bit further about that dynamic between Elwood and Turner, because that is
Hmm.
such a big part of this movie, and obviously has a big part of the ending of this film. And when you look at the two, so Elwood has this ardent enthusiasm, right?
Hmm.
This resoluteness, something that becomes a little bit of a hindrance, or maybe even a lot of bit of a hindrance for him when
Sure.
he first arrives at
Mhm.
Nickel Academy. Turner, on the other hand, is this realist. He knows what it takes to survive. It's a dynamic that mirrors Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier in The Defiant Ones, a film that we actually see at one point in Nickel
Mhm.
Yeah,
Boys.
very referenced.
But Nickel Boys is a much more uncompromising film. Like, these two characters, there's an illuminating hope that it wants to relish in, but it also lives in the real world where freedom has a price, which is
Hmm.
ultimately why the film is so heartbreaking. And I love how that pathos is funneled through the different perspectives of these two characters as
Yeah.
they start to bleed together in those final moments, especially for Turner. His final act is born out of hope that he really didn't have before, that
Hmm.
comes about specifically, exclusively because of this relationship that he has with Elwood and how that
Yeah.
evolves throughout the film. I think about that conversation they have after the punishment scene that Sophia brought up earlier, which is incredibly visceral. He's in the hospital recovering, and they have a conversation where this duality really strikes. And you hear vividly Turner talk about how the protesting and the movement outside of this, it
Mhm.
barely works, is the words that he uses to describe the
Hmm.
movement. So he just doesn't see the world in the same way that others do. And he maintains that survivalist ethos throughout a lot of this film. But because of the compassion that he sees in Elwood and the choices that he makes, it is fascinating to see how that does start to change him a little bit. And without getting into details, because obviously I don't
Yeah.
want to spoil the film,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
the irony of that with Turner is just some of the best storytelling I've
Yeah.
seen all
Oh
year.
yeah.
It's obviously devastating, but man, it's great stuff.
Yeah. And I'll add too that these two very different perspectives, one of hope and
Hmm.
optimism, and the other of I've seen this all before. A place built on genocide is not going to change.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Those two dueling yet complementary perspectives when you think about friendship,
Mhm.
that is why the book works so well. Because
Okay.
in the
Mhm.
novel, you do feel like you actually can't really be just one or the other. You have to have a little bit there. It has to be a little bit
Okay.
of both. And the fact that we are switching between the two of them, between Elwood and Turner, and they're so different, yet they admire each other in different
Mhm.
ways. I think that's what's so beautiful about it. And when you're watching the
Hmm.
film too, and like when they have the inspection, and again, I don't want to get into just spoilers, but just
Yeah.
that moment when they have the inspection and Elwood he's been documenting and
Yeah.
he wants them to see that notebook. And you are just, at least I was so happy when Turner takes it because
Yeah.
you know that Turner has a different type of intelligence than
Yes.
Elwood does. And he's going to make sure that nothing bad happens from that moment when
Mhm.
Elwood's optimism might have done might have
Yeah.
done something worse.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I think on the point of documenting, what is so great about the film and really smart about RaMell Ross being the director here and his experience as a photographer and as a documentary filmmaker too, is that what he has talked about at Q&As and in interviews is that him in history, the idea of seeing photography of Black people, specifically Black people in the South, it always felt observational, or the people in the photos didn't feel real to him. He didn't understand who was taking the photo, what it was trying to say. And
like it's not even telling half the story at that point.
right. It was this bit of voyeurism there. And here he removes that entirely and still incorporates images from history and, footage even of the marathon or of Apollo 8. Like those inclusions that he has, it's like those key pieces of the 20th century, yet mixed in with this photography and photography of his own. I think reframes authorship and adaptation and what it means to document.
Because it's so easy for us to maintain our naivete when a particular news thing doesn't affect us directly, right? And RaMell Ross is certainly getting around that by finding a way to fuse all of this together, to bring a new sensibility to it while still acknowledging that this is history, but he's not just merely telling us what this was. And I love how he's able to invite us into that. And that fusion is even taken further by the time we reach the film's climax. I love how you said there, Sophia, that in the book, it acknowledges that even though Elwood and Turner have very different perspectives and outlooks on life, the best way to move forward is to have some type of balance between the two internally, right? Because by the end of the movie, there is kind of this fusion between the two characters in a way that is kind of literal, I'll simply say, for reasons I won't get into. I won't get into the specifics of how that's achieved, but that literal fusion between the two, I do think is very fascinating to see, not just how one character ultimately changes the other, but how they become this walking embodiment of both of them. I found that beautiful.
Yeah. And to speak to what you were saying there, Sophia, as far as authorship and documenting and offering perspectives, was desperately trying to find the review in which I read this, and I couldn't do it in real time. So it's something I might have to do later on and put it into the show notes, because I was reading a review, and I'm paraphrasing here since I couldn't find it to read it verbatim, but it said something along the lines of the way this film is structured, the POV of it all, it is to teach the viewer how to see, how to feel the world through Black eyes. If that lesson doesn't take, the blame does not lie with the movie, which I thought was a really potent line.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to a lot of what you're saying in terms of how RaMell Ross and his team here are able to take ownership of this story, give it a new and fresh perspective that does immerse us into a world that we otherwise wouldn't get to experience, that is, antithetical to that voyeuristic context. And it makes it all the more intimate. And to your point, Brennan, not just with one character, but with two, because of how we're often immersed into both of those perspectives and how much we come to deeply love both of these characters and the endearing friendship that forms between them and that constant tug of war. Like you understand why both of these characters see the world the way they do. And I think at the end of this film, I think perhaps the irony of that duality I mentioned earlier of objective and subjective, I think there's an argument to be made that if you walk away, you don't have to love the film, but at the very least, if there's not an understanding of what these characters experienced, that is on the viewer. That is like, there is kind of an objective sense to that in some ways. And I just love how RaMell Ross is able to have his cake and eat it too. And I think he does it absolutely beautifully.
Speaking of cake, the scene with
Oh yeah, we got to speak
Anjanou
about
Ellis
that.
Taylor
Yes.
as Elwood's grandmother when she's slicing the
transition,
pieces of cake. Yeah, I had to.
Oh.
I wanted to talk about that scene anyway, and I wanted to talk about her, but I think that is so beautiful, and shows the love that she has for Elwood and the love in their relationship, which is something that Turner, we know, didn't have because of how he reacts to her hug later on, which we can also talk about. But I like how this character, she uses this moment in slicing up these pieces of cake before Elwood goes away to Nickel to talk about how similar things have happened to her family.
Yeah.
There's this idea of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or it just comes down to being unlucky. And that's Elwood's lot in life, right? He does everything right. He has a job that he does really well working at that store. He does really well in school. He, is supposed to go to college, and then this is what happens to him. And the way that I think RaMell Ross shows that both in this scene, and we have that great sound effect too of her like taking that knife and scraping the icing off. That's perfect. And then when we also see the brochure for the technical college slipping down the refrigerator because the magnet can't hold it.
Yeah.
We've all seen that happen on our, I think, refrigerators when something won't hold or it's a little too heavy. But here
certainly
it's
more symbolic here at that point.
Right. It's his lottery ticket slipping down. It can't, the weight won't hold. And I think that the way he plays with visual metaphor and visual language is really stunning.
Yeah. And the idea that being unlucky, as you said, or in the wrong place at the wrong time means more to them and this specific demographic than it did for, let's say, the white community at that time. It was a more devastating situation to find themselves in because they were more wrongfully and harshly judged for that. And that's definitely emphasized. And that's one of the things that I think sparks the curiosity in the viewer to really feel this perspective and how real that it ultimately is. And Anjanou Ellis Taylor, probably the most huggable movie character of the year. And I mean that literally.
In this film.
I mean that literally. Yeah. Yeah. I think he's terrific here. That hugging scene that we brought up, that you brought up there, Sophia, I think is beautiful, not just because of Anjanou Ellis Taylor, but also Turner's kind of timid reaction to it.
His body language there that's communicated via the camera.
Somehow the camera communicates that sense of doubt and uncertainty, that confusion of what love actually can feel like is communicated there, not just in the camera, but also in Brandon Wilson's vocal performance there too. But again, Anjanou Ellis Taylor, terrific in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, I am certainly biased, and perhaps you two are as well, given the love that we share for this movie. I truly do not understand how, in a year where Best Supporting Actress is, let's be honest, a little weaker than it has been for other years, how she is not dominating the discourse. It blows my mind. Like, she should be one of the front runners, like by a landslide.
Actually a supporting character, right?
And
she
she's
gives
an actual
supporting performance when we have a lot of co-leads in the race.
Category
clearly.
fraud is a real thing.
It is a very real thing. Like, it just absolutely blows my mind, because she is phenomenal in this film. The cake scene I certainly wanted to bring up as well. It is incredible, the tender hope that she brings to that when she's monologuing there about her family and some of the tragedies that they've experienced. Like, that moment alone, I think, gives you reasoning for why Elwood has this lingering optimism. It's such a powerful moment, let alone, going back to some of those early images in the film with young Elwood. That whole sequence ends with another embrace between the two characters, where she wakes up in the middle of the night, scared half to death, as children tend to do sometimes. Certainly know that from experience. And, you give them that embrace. And that is such a wonderful, tender, warm moment there with that character that, like from there, despite everything they go through here, like she doesn't waver at all as who she is at her core. Even when Elwood goes to the reform school, indignantly for sure, but she still carries that warmth and that hope. When perhaps at her lowest is, and maybe slight spoilers here, but when she has to reveal to Elwood about the lawyer, and what happened there's certainly disappointment that she conveys for sure, and heartache, but she also demonstrates a strength that is honestly, in some ways, now that I'm thinking about it here, Elwood kind of helps lift her up in that moment a little bit. So it's like her spirit as a conduit coming through Elwood, which I think is really great.
Yeah, they kind of switch roles there for a moment.
Kind of switch roles slightly, but still, like, because it's her spirit giving that to Elwood, which is kind of what makes that bounce back all the more fascinating. And then, of course, those scenes at the very end of the film as well. She might not have the most of screen time, but when she is here, it is utterly impactful. Everything she does is stunning here, and it is all born out of that tender warmth that she conveys in every moment. It's breathtaking.
When I met Jomo Frey a few months ago at an event for the film, I was talking to him about it, and he has so many amazing stories to share, but one of my favorites that he did share was in that scene when she's telling him the news from the lawyer. I think what's so beautiful about that too is that she still has hope despite the system breaking her and her family before. And the system, again, just takes that away from them, and she's still just there to tell him anyway. But one of the things that Frey said was that, in the way that this film was shot, you had to get very close to the actors. And he was operating the camera right in a way that was completely different than he ever had before. But in that moment, we see Elwood look down, and the camera looks down. And he said that Anjanou Ellis-Taylor looked at him and said, "Elwood, look at me." And that made him tilt the camera back up.
Oh, that is so good.
That's so great to hear, because I think I remember hearing a few interviews with Anjanou Ellis-Taylor and how it took a little while to get used to this new filmmaking method that rather than don't look at the camera being the primary rule you follow as an actor, the rule here was look at the camera.
Look at the camera.
Yeah. And it took some time to get used to that. So the fact that she was finally able to treat the character or the camera as a character, quite literally, assuming maybe if this was shot chronologically, I don't know if it was, but that does seem like that there maybe is some type of growth there. I found that really fascinating.
I'm going to clip this and I'm going to tag it on social media with the Academy every day from now until Oscar voting ends. Because that's amazing.
Yeah, it was one of those things. I got goosebumps, and I told him, I said, I have goosebumps. What? How did you do that? Like, how this movie is just, it's different than anything that we have.
It's remarkable.
It's a shame that she's not like louder in the conversation as far as awards consideration here. It's certainly a quieter performance. And I mean, in the past, when it comes to certain categories, not every category, but I feel like a lot of times the Academy tends to favor the loudest person in the room as opposed to the best person in the room. It's kind of like how we talk about with a category like best editing, right, JD? Sometimes they confuse most editing with best editing. So it's probably easy to overlook a very delicate performance like Anjanou Ellis-Taylor here, but that's the wrong approach. I think she's so good here.
Yeah. And so much of it is really just in how she holds a close-up. It reminded me a lot, and I wrote this in the review, of like Jonathan Demme, his actors in movies, how they'll hold close-ups, or even Paul Thomas Anderson, very good at them too. But here, I think she has to communicate so much with her eyes because she's looking right into the camera the whole time. And it is, she doesn't have as many of those loud scenes, I think, that you expect, again, like most acting.
But it's a lot of it's also one continuous scene too.
Oh,
a lot of unbroken takes, so you have to carry this consistently. And I don't know how many takes they would do of certain scenes like this, but this is a movie where the average take is probably like 3 minutes or something like that. There's a lot of unbroken sequences here, so that's a challenging task for any actor, and she's certainly up for it.
And that also speaks to the prowess of the editing as well. Because sometimes the best editing isn't the most editing; it's the best editing. And
this editing is amazing.
Insane. It is like sometimes it's clever or funny, but a lot of the times it speaks to the emotional underbelly of the film or the visceral images when it comes to the historical context or the trauma that is invoked here. The moment you spoke to her earlier, Sophia, when he is getting punished and we cut to while we hear the sounds of the punishment happening, it is overlaid with those black and white images and then transitions to older Elder, excuse me.
Yeah.
That is the best transition sequence of the year. I mean, it was stunning.
It's up there.
Like you're sitting there absolutely stunned by that series of events. It is unreal.
Yeah.
Or the editing of the lunch sequence, as we mentioned earlier. The editing, the performances here, like everything about this film is truly masterful. I don't have anything bad to say about this film at all.
And it gets better every time you watch it too. I think new layers reveal themselves or you engage with it differently. And how natural is that, right? With this type of point of view, you're going to bring something new to it every time, so it's going to change.
Yeah, the best movies are the ones that feel like you're watching it for the first time all over again. And I say this as someone that has only seen Nickel Boys one time. I can't wait to watch it again, but I could tell even in that one time, this is going to reveal something new every time I watch it. It's going to feel like a new perspective, a new interpretation. And the best movies, I think, offer that.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic in a way because, for as gorgeous as the film is, it is kind of devastating when you get to the end of it. It is quite tragic and harrowing, but there is kind of this beautiful spirit to the film that you can't help but love. That certainly, welcomes a rewatch. I mean, I noted earlier, I rewatched this earlier today. I was very much eager to, which is why I need to get that stinking kid to go to sleep. Just go to bed. But I was eager to give this a go, despite how heartbreaking it is at the end. There's so much here to unpack and to dissect, and it's I mean, to your point, Sophia, that's something that's only going to happen more and more as you get into it.
And that final shot, I'm not going to spoil what it is, but it's an invitation, I think, to engage with it and to watch it again and to think about it and have conversations about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Could
good.
not have said it better myself.
It is so good.
Yeah. So who do we need to speak to at the Academy? That's my final question here. Like, do you know anybody?
Do we have any contacts?
If I did, I'd have a laundry list of things to talk to them about this year.
Yeah.
Just give them my personal ballot.
Yeah, exactly.
This is what the preferential ballot should look like. Yeah. This is the ranked order. Here are my categories.
We don't need no Amelia Perez's in this game at all.
Oh, Amelia. They picked the wrong songs from Amelia Perez. Anyway, so
the wrong movie by having it there in the first place.
At any rate,
fair enough.
Do you guys have any final thoughts on Nickel Boys before we wind down here?
Go see it in theaters. Go support this film and read the book too. Highly recommend both. I think
it on Audible?
Doesn't really matter what order.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Is it on Audible? Do you know?
Yes, it is on Audible and I think Spotify audiobooks as well.
Yeah, I think I saw it there.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
I know what my next few months are going to be.
And there are some changes too, which I think are interesting to see, what he changed, including, I mean, he changed the title a little bit too.
Yeah.
Because the book is The Nickel Boys, which is an interesting thing to think about. But I would just say go support this in theaters, talk about it. It is like we were talking about earlier, such an active viewing experience, and one that you should just give yourself over to and think about your own role in it and your own complicity.
Yeah, I love your comment there on the power of the word "the."
Mhm.
And how that can mean something, maybe even not mean something. The fact that this is just called Nickel Boys and not the Nickel Boys, like Colson
Right.
Whitehead's book was, I think that's really, really interesting. Certainly want to dive into that further. I do look forward to reading the book at some point soon. I do at least want to comment that the film has quite a bit of magical realism at times. We didn't really emphasize
Those
some of those touches.
animals, yes.
So it's so interesting, and
Mhm.
this is what I love about the film, and this is something we talked about a lot, JD, when we had Eric talking about Queer. There's a lot about that movie I was not able to decipher in the moment, but I loved how kind of confused I was by certain aspects of it, and there are moments of magical realism here that it absolutely makes me want to go back and revisit this film to understand what maybe some of these symbolic touches ultimately mean. So it's very artful in a way, but still it still has this universality to it. And a movie is, or a filmmaker is often very good at doing that. I love when a filmmaker can do all those things simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah, I cannot wait to give this another go. I've seen it twice already. I'm eager to give it a third watch. Perhaps I'll do that by the time we get to the In Session Film Awards,
Sure.
because this is quite easily one of my favorite films of the year. It will be represented quite a lot when it comes to that. But yeah, I love everything about this film. And the one thing I'll just reiterate one more time, because I did mention this earlier in my opening thoughts, and then we talked about all the other great aspects of the film. But I do want to echo Alex Summers' score once again. It is really, really good. Certainly gives a great tender quality to this film that I absolutely adore and love. And there's like, I don't know how to articulate it. Maybe you can, Brendan, but there's some sort of effect that they overlay over the orchestra that gives it like this out of, I don't know how to say it. Like it feels like it comes from a different time and place.
I know what you're talking about. I think if anything, it's probably a mixing thing, something that happens in the post-recording process, because it feels like they add a lot of reverb to it, which gives it almost like this echoey kind of ethereal vibe. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is exactly, but it kind of distorts and disorients the music a little bit, which I think is really appropriate to this film. So like it, again, like the music does a great job, whatever it was technically, to kind of complement those dualities we were talking about earlier in terms of the beauty of the film and also the cruelty of it. And that polarity here that these characters would have been experiencing. Like the music is really great in that as well. So
absolutely,
certainly wanted to highlight that one more time as well.
Love the music. That's a great call
really,
out.
really good. Really, really good. Yeah, please go see this film as soon as you can. Wherever it's available, you definitely want to go and check it out. It is one of the best films of the year.
Yep.
If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media. We would love to hear your thoughts. Sophia, thanks for being here. This was a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me back. I was trying to think of when I had been on, and I think we talked about the Fablemans was the last time I came on. Yeah. So thank you so much for having me back to talk about this beautiful, brilliant movie.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great to have you here. Cannot wait to get you back. Where can we find your work online? Where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Sophia_Sim, letterboxed at Faye Dunaway. It's my username there that I claimed.
Love that.
You can find my favorite actress. You can find me, my podcast, Oscar Wilde, wherever you listen to podcasts. We just did a big award season roundup about the Golden Globes and Critics Awards, and we have an episode on White Christmas coming up this week. And then you can find all of my written work, reviews, including one of this film, interviews, including one with Anjanou Ellis-Taylor at Awards Watch.
Yes, please go and give her a follow. Please go check out her work. Listen to the podcast. It's really great.
I agree.
The episode she just mentioned, the last one, was really fun.
Yeah, and we just did back-to-back reviews here, JD, where we had guests from Awards Watch.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what's in the water there. But
Oh, yeah,
some really great
Eric.
conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys do phenomenal work over there.
Yeah.
And speaking of Sophia's work, there is one review out there you should probably go and check out at the very least. Because they've taken her review and plastered it all over the marketing for this film. So definitely go and give that a read. Yeah, it's fantastic stuff. And thanks again, Sophia, for being here. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was great.
Really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Please go and check out our latest review, as Brennan just talked about. We had Eric Anderson on to talk about Luca Guadagnino's Queer. That was a really great conversation. That is available right now. And then on the main show this week, episode 615, we are talking about terrible marketing when it comes to Hollywood. So that's a topic of conversation. And we're going to talk about the Critics' Choice nominations as well.
Yeah.
So you can be on the lookout for all of that. In the meantime, thanks again, Sophia, for being here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.